On July 11th, 2007, at the age of 94. I have a really nice picture up here of Lady Bird right here in the signature. She dies on July 11th, 2007, at the age of 94 and was buried by her husband's side in Stonewall, Texas. Wonderful lady, Lady Bird. What's that?
She never remarried.
Never remarried.
Did you meet her?
No, I didn't. I would like to. Now, how long did she go? 73, 83, 93, 2003, 34 years. Didn't remarry.
She didn't date
I
either?
don't think so. No, I don't think she did.
Really?
No.
Not at all?
Okay, now, here's what we're going to talk about next, kiddos. We're going to talk about laws that were passed during President Johnson's completion of the Kennedy term. What laws were passed? Johnson was a law passer. This guy passed a lot of legislation. So we're going to tell you what he passed during the completion of Kennedy's term, and then we'll get into what he passed during his term when he gets reelected. Okay? Obviously, this is a big one for me. 5 days after the assassination of President Kennedy, President Johnson addressed Congress. 5 days after the assassination of President Kennedy, the new President Lyndon Johnson addressed Congress. And he asked members of Congress during that address to complete the programs that had been initiated by President Kennedy. So again, 5 days after the assassination, Lyndon Johnson speaks before Congress. He addresses the United States Congress, the House and the Senate, and he asks those two branches of Congress to finish any of the programs that President Kennedy had started. So as much criticism as Lyndon Johnson gets, you know, for rushing Kennedy out of the White House and getting moved in, we'll talk about that if you want, he was committed to finishing the programs that John Kennedy started, even though he wasn't a huge friend of John Kennedy, but he felt that was right. Now, the act we're going to talk about that's most important was the act that Kennedy initially sent to Congress that led to the March on Washington and the I Have a Dream speech by Martin Luther King Jr. And that law that was passed on July 2nd of 1964 was the Civil Rights Act of 1964. And remember we talked about that. Remember what that act was supposed to do? Stop desegregated businesses, remember? Based on race, color, religion, sex, or national origin. Remember, that's how it initially went up. And I told you that, unfortunately, President Kennedy did not get a chance to see that go through Congress after the March on Washington because he was assassinated. Well, Lyndon Johnson made that his top priority to get that civil rights bill passed, and it finally was passed on July 2nd, 1964, and it was called the Civil Rights Act of 1964. And what did it do? It did do what the original bill said, and then something else. It did desegregate all businesses based on race, color, religion, sex, and national origin. That's what the original bill was set up to do, was to make sure that all businesses were desegregated. You couldn't discriminate against someone in a business because of their race, their color, their religion, their sex, or their national origin. But it also stated that racial discrimination would be illegal in the use of federal funds. That racial discrimination would be deemed illegal in the use of federal funds. So anything at all that the government financed, such as schools, we could not discriminate based on race, color, religion, sex, and national origin. Hiring, etc. Now this came out, this is a commemorative coin in 2014 that commemorated the Civil Rights Act of 1964. So we still have it. Which 64, 74, 84, 94, 2004. What the anniversary? You could look at that, pass that around.
Wait, what was it? It would be illegal in what?
It'd be illegal to use discrimination in using any federal funds, and that covers so many things. Like the school is financed by federal funds, right? So you couldn't discriminate in the hiring or discriminate in someone coming to your school based on race, color, religion, sex, or national origin. But I mean like your anything that the federal government pays for, your city, I mean, everything. It just covers everything that the government finances. So it was a landmark act that was passed that helped kind of slow down discrimination in our country. Now, I'm going to give you some other laws that were passed during the time Johnson served out the remainder of the Kennedy term. And some of these are very important to you today, and will be very important to you in the next 2 or 3 months. Okay? The first one isn't so much having anything to do with you today, but Kennedy had set out to pass a Wilderness Act. Johnson carried it through, and it became known as the Wilderness Act of 1964. So the first law passed during the time Johnson served out the remainder of Kennedy's term was the Wilderness Act of 1964. What do you think that did? Any, you guys going into fish and game or anything? Is that your big game?
Protection of wildlife.
Right, well, not so much wildlife. It would encompass wildlife, but what it did is it set aside 9 million acres of national forest and national park land and stated that that land would be what? Wilderness. No building on it, no ATVs. I'm not saying you couldn't hunt in it, but you couldn't develop it. So it took 9 million acres in the United States and designated that forest land as wilderness. No building, no ATVs. What's that? Absolutely. Yeah, it would be to be deemed wilderness. It's not to be developed. You can hunt and fish, but you can't. You have to ride horses in. You couldn't take ATVs or pickups. We have wilderness land. Yeah, and we have that here in Wyoming now. We've got wilderness land in Wyoming right now. Yeah, no, that's what it did. Now the next act is very important to you, and it was the National Defense Education Act. And that act split up into 2 separate laws, which we'll talk about. But the overall is the National Defense Education Act. Anybody want to guess what the National Defense Education Act did?
Defense and space.
No? You ever heard of FAFSA?
Oh.
It gave federal dollars. It never, believe it or not, federal government did not give you money prior to this. It gave federal dollars to schools, colleges, and universities. How do we make, you know how this school works? Do you guys have a clue on that? I'll talk about it in a minute. We'll go through that. But it gave federal dollars to schools, colleges, and universities. For the first time in history, the federal government gave money to public schools, public colleges, and public universities. Prior to that, they had to charge tuition and a lot of money to make it run because they got no federal support. And I'll explain that.
Even like elementary school.
Well, we're going to, that's what we're getting to. Yeah, even elementary. However, what's that?
At least the people who went to that one school but got denied by that government.
Now listen, the National Defense Education Act was split into 2 more acts, which Kyra's talking about. First one was called the Elementary and Secondary Education Act. So this National Defense Education Act that gave for the first time federal dollars to schools, colleges, and universities was split into 2 different laws, the first being the Elementary and Secondary Education Act. You know what they did, Kyra, with this federal money according to the Elementary and Secondary Education Act?
Probably gave it to
Gave it to schools. Now I'll tell you how this works. You may or may not know this. But our enrollment's important because every kid we have in the district is worth like $6,000. So if we have 1,000 kids that go to school K through 12 in this district, 1,000 times 6,000? 600,000, okay? Now, that's what we buy, desks, and pay teachers, and give paper. That's what we do. That's why you have a free public education, because population's so important. So if we get, I screwed up on that. Montana gets about 6,000 a kid. Wyoming gets about 16,000 a kid.
Oh gosh.
And that's why Wyoming pays better, etc. So you take 10,000 times 1,000 kids, how much is that? $1 million, is it not?
10 million.
10 million, it's 10 million. And that's federal money that we get. Now I'll give you an idea. You know what, the biggest, I'll bet you 80 to 85% of that money we get goes to what?
Salary.
Teacher salaries, administrative salaries, aide salaries, salaries. Okay? And the other 15% is used to buy your desks and everything else. But think about that. If it wasn't for this law passed, this would not be a free public education for you. You'd be paying. You ever heard of Billings Central High School? Do they get money from the feds? No, because they're religious based. So they charge tuition. Those kids go to Billings Central, we played basketball last year or whatever, they pay money to go, thousands of dollars to go to school. They pay for their own textbooks. They pay for their own things. So what the Elementary and Secondary Education Act did, it gave government money to both elementary and high schools to help pay for things like textbooks, supplies, lunches, etc., etc., etc. Now you understand that elementary and junior high are the same thing, right? So elementary is technically K through 8, and high school is 9 through 12. But what the Elementary and Secondary Education Act did that was under the National Defense Education Act is it gave government money for the first time to elementary and high schools to help pay for a free public education. The second part of the National Defense Education Act is what you're really into now, and that's the Higher Education Act, which gave government money and financial aid so you could go to colleges and universities to further your studies. So this FAFSA money that you get, if you get grants that you don't have to pay back or scholarships because you have a good ACT, who's paying for that? The government, which in essence you are to a point, but these colleges and universities are getting the same money to help the financial aid and stuff for you to go to college. That's what FAFSA does. Now, if you go to a private college like Rocky Mountain College, does Rocky Mountain College get all this government money? No, because they're a Methodist-orientated college. That's why their tuition is $25,000 a year instead of $8,000. Because they have to run the college on no federal monies. Does that make sense? So a free public education, everybody gets one at the elementary and high school level. The college level is different, and it's split up into two ways. You have private and public colleges. The public colleges, like the University of Wyoming, Casper, they get federal aid for the government, which allows them to give you financial aid and them enough money to run their colleges and pay their professors. Whereas a private college does not get federal funding, and that's why their tuition and fees are so much higher, because they're paying for that themselves. My alma mater, Rocky Mountain College, when I went there, was like $8,700 a year to go, where you could go to Eastern Montana College, which is MSU Billings now, for about a third of that. That's what the difference was. What? Yeah, you could go in, 1977, a long time ago, but that's the difference in colleges. But that's where you, if you pay your tuition stuff and go, you go, boy, I was thinking about going to Carroll College in Helena, but man, their tuition's like $30,000 a year. The reason it's $30,000 a year is because it's a private Catholic college in which they have to raise their own fees. BYU is a private LDS college. They don't get government funding. So that's why their tuition is high, because you got to pay that. And they get support from the church, as Billings Central gets support from the Catholic Church in Billings, and etc. But it's a whole different game. Any questions on any of those acts? Okay, well then we'll finish today with the election of 1964. Interesting election. The election of 1964. Now, there was no question when the Democrats got together at their national convention, there was no question who their presidential candidate was going to be. It was going to be Lyndon Johnson. The big question was, who would Johnson pick to be his vice president? Okay? Now, see if you can remember this name. When Johnson made his decision, he picked Senator Hubert H. Humphrey from Minnesota. Where have we heard that name before?
C.C. Grohl?
No, he was
one of the 5 people that ran.
He was one of the.
Johnson.
That's correct. Very good. He was one of the 5. He and Kennedy were the front runners.
Yeah.
Remember in 1960. But remember, he also gave the speech during the election of 1948 where he said that the Democratic Party should step up on civil rights, which led to the Southern delegates walking out. Remember that? And Truman was really nervous because Hubert Humphrey got on stage and said, this Democratic Party has got to put in their platform civil rights. And all the Southern delegates walked out. Well, he came back on the scene, and he and Kennedy were the front runners for the Democratic nomination in 1960, and now Johnson picks him to be his running mate in 64, Senator Hubert H. Humphrey of Minnesota. Now, the Republican Party is going to have a little bit of a mess here because they have a split in the party. They're badly divided into two groups. You have the conservative wing of the Republican Party and the liberal wing, very good, of the Republican Party. And anytime you have a split like that, it's not good, okay? And the only way you're going to win an election if you have a split party is to nominate one person for the presidency that's either liberal or conservative, and the other person for the vice presidency that's the opposite. Does that make sense? It's the only way you get along. So, the conservative Republicans were supporting Senator Barry Goldwater of Arizona. Barry Goldwater. By the way, there's Barry Goldwater up there with the glasses on, and this is Hubert Humphrey here. Okay? So, Barry Goldwater will be the conservative Republican's choice. He is a senator from Arizona. Senator from Arizona. So the conservative Republicans want to support Barry Goldwater, Senator of Arizona, as their candidate. Well, is he going to get nominated on the first ballot if you've got liberals out there? What's the only way he's going to get the nomination?
Vice President.
Is if you kind of promise behind the back doors that you'll nominate a liberal vice president. So with that agreement made, Barry Goldwater wins the nomination for the Republican Party on the first ballot. Okay? And the deal is made that, you know, we'll balance the ticket, and if you choose me, I'll pick a liberal vice presidential candidate to run with. Okay? So Senator Goldwater gave the liberal wing of the party the idea that he would balance the ticket and he would choose a liberal candidate as his running mate for the vice presidency. And when that was agreed upon, the liberals went ahead and supported Goldwater, and he was nominated on the first ballot for the presidency. Well, once you nominate him, there's no going back, right? Well, Goldwater shocks the liberal Republicans by choosing conservative Congressman William Miller as his running mate.
That's shady.
That was stupid.
Because
Because what do you think those liberal Republicans did?
Oh, they're gonna be ticked.
They voted Democrat. Yeah, that was bad. That was a bad move. Goldwater was arrogant enough to think that he could maybe pull this off. He doesn't want a liberal Republican vice president, so he chooses a conservative and Congressman William Miller, and the liberal wing of the party was furious. And I wouldn't say all, but a good number of liberal Republicans voted for Lyndon Johnson in the election of 1964. So again, Goldwater chooses conservative Congressman William Miller as his running mate. The liberal wing of the party was furious, and because of this, historians state that many liberal Republicans voted for the Democratic candidate, Lyndon Johnson, in 1964. Now listen, Johnson wins 61% of the popular vote. That is a crushing. If you can get 49-51, if you can win the popular vote 49-51, that's a pretty good margin. Matter of fact, Hillary Clinton won the popular vote in this last election. Okay? About 49-51. He wins in the popular vote by 61%. That's like a major league killing. Now, listen to this. There were 538 electoral votes that you could have gotten in this election. That wasn't 2/3 majority. That was the total you could get. If you won everyone, which never happens, it would have been 538. Johnson wins 486 of those 538. Goldwater only gets 52 electoral votes. That is like a major league crushing.
Is it the worst in history?
Close, yeah. 500 538 to 486, only receiving 52 in a crushing defeat.
What did LBJ get?
He got 486 out of 538.
So who had the most ever?
I'd have to look that up. It was an early elections, when they didn't have as many votes as far as the margin of victory. Now, what is Johnson hoping for? Because you have congressional elections also. What's he want, baby?
He wants,
What's he want? He's a Democrat. What's he want in these congressional elections? He wants the Democrats to win. It's much easier for a president to do well if he's got his party in control. And he was very fortunate because Lyndon Johnson got what he wanted. The Democrats also ended up winning Congress in this election of 1964. So it's going to be very advantageous for President Johnson to go there. Okay? Well, that'll take us to our next subtopic. We'll get a short start on here, which was President Johnson's Great Society. Now, I'm going to be impressed. Somebody should know this. What was the name of Kennedy's administration?
New Frontier.
New Frontier. How about Eisenhower's?
The New Deal.
Modern Republicanism. Very good. How about Truman's?
Fair Deal?
Fair Deal, that way, and FDR's New Deal. So the name of Johnson's administration will be known in American history as the Great Society. Great Society. So President Johnson's administration will be known in American history as the Great Society. And it's going to consist of 3 political philosophies, and that's what we'll quit on today. So again, President Johnson's administration will be known in American history as the Great Society, and will consist of these 3 political philosophies. Number 1, keep the nation's economy growing strong. Keep the nation's economy growing strong, which tells you that the economy was pretty good, right? Prior to his election, right? If you're going to keep it going strong, that means it was strong. So to keep the nation's economy growing strong.